January 1944. Snow drifts across the muddy courtyard of Stalag Luft III, the Luftwaffe-run POW camp in Sagan, Germany. A bitter wind cuts through the gray barracks, carrying the faint clatter of tin cups and whispered German curses. Inside one wooden hut, a group of Allied prisoners huddle around a small table, unwrapping parcels stamped with red crosses. The paper tears with a crisp crack, revealing neatly stacked cans, chocolate bars, powdered coffee, and biscuits, far beyond what most civilians could hope to see. Eyes widen, forks hover midair. For some, it is disbelief. For others, quiet wonder. One British officer mutters under his breath, "Better than Christmas at home." Outside, German guards patrol with a mix of indifference and suspicion. They have seen POWs survive on meager rations before, but these American parcels are different. Overflowing, meticulously packed, almost obscene in their abundance. Whispers of envy ripple through the camp. In that frozen moment, the stark contrast between survival and sustenance becomes undeniable. The prisoners are nourished, fortified not only in body but in spirit, while the world outside struggles to scrape together scraps. This simple meal, carefully measured and shipped across oceans, will quietly alter perceptions of the war, one bite at a time. By the winter of 1942, the world was deep into the throes of total war. Across Europe, rationing was no longer a choice, it was a grim necessity. Cities bore the scars of relentless bombing campaigns, rail lines were torn, and farmland lay fallow under occupation. German civilians survived on a strict calorie count, often less than 1,500 calories a day. Bread was thin, soup watery, and meat a rare luxury. The Wehrmacht's victories in the east and west had not translated into sustenance for the population. Amid this scarcity, the United States had mobilized an unprecedented logistical apparatus. The American military, conscious of both soldier morale and the obligations of the Geneva Conventions, designed rations with precision. K-rations, first introduced in 1942, provided roughly 2,130 calories per day in compact, portable form. C-rations, canned and ready to eat, offered a mix of meat, vegetables, and baked goods. These were supplemented by Red Cross parcels, often delivered directly to POW camps in Europe, containing chocolate, powdered milk, coffee, and preserved meats. Every item was engineered for maximum nutrition, durability, and even psychological effect. Food that looked plentiful could lift morale, sustain hope, and remind prisoners they were not forgotten. Transporting these parcels was a feat in itself. The Atlantic was a war zone. Convoys, heavily escorted, battled U-boats in stormy seas. Parcels were stamped, cataloged, and meticulously packed in factories thousands of miles away. By late 1943, the United States had developed an almost industrial efficiency in feeding not only its own troops, but also prisoners captured by the Axis powers. Meanwhile, European civilians were rationed by numbers. A loaf of bread, a thin slice of cheese, a ration card for margarine or sugar. The disparity was profound. German POW camps reflected a rigid hierarchy and strict rules, but food distribution remained one of the most acute challenges. Stalag Luft III, for example, housed thousands of Allied airmen. Each prisoner's daily German-issued ration was meager. Black bread, thin soup, and sometimes a small portion of margarine or sausage. Calories averaged around 1,700 per day, barely enough to sustain health, much less the intense labor or escape efforts that prisoners often attempted. Camps were cold, barracks overcrowded, and sanitation often inadequate. Starvation was not the primary goal, but it was an ever-present threat. When Allied parcels began arriving, the contrast was immediate and stark. A single Red Cross package could contain more meat, sugar, and chocolate than a German civilian might receive in a week. For POWs, these parcels were a lifeline. They were not just food, they were news, comfort, and a tangible reminder of a world beyond barbed wire. Even for the guards, the sight was jarring. Enemy prisoners nourished and almost pampered, while local civilians queued for scraps. Reports from camp diaries reveal subtle unease among German soldiers. There was no official complaint. International law sanctioned these parcels. But the psychological impact was undeniable. Behind this logistical marvel was a deliberate strategy. The United States War Department recognized that well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, less likely to succumb to illness, and more resilient in spirit. Packages were designed not only to meet nutritional needs but also to provide comfort. Chocolate bars were not incidental. They offered calories, yes, but also a taste of normal life. Coffee and powdered milk reminded men of home. Even the smallest biscuits and jam portions were meticulously measured, each contributing to a sense of abundance in stark contrast to camp rations. By late 1943, the phenomenon had reached a tipping point. Reports from camps trickled back to German commandants. Prisoners were healthier than expected, morale was unusually high, and the disparity with the civilian population was glaring. Officers began to whisper about the American luxury and its effect on prisoners. In the bitter winter of 1943 to 44, this difference became impossible to ignore. The war outside raged on, but inside these camps the war for survival had taken on an unexpected dimension, a battle fought with tin cans, chocolate, and biscuits. The arrival of these parcels did more than fill stomachs. It shifted perspectives, created envy, and foreshadowed one of the quieter but deeply human aspects of the conflict. That nourishment itself could become a weapon, a symbol and a point of contention in a world consumed by scarcity and suffering. In the cold light of a European winter, the question was no longer just who would win on the battlefield, but who could endure. And remarkably, how food alone could make that difference. While prisoners of war began to receive parcels from the Red Cross, the German civilian population faced a grimmer reality. Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed factories, railways, and farmland, leaving food scarce and unevenly distributed. Cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden were rationed strictly. Bread, potatoes, and a thin slice of margarine or sausage defined daily life. Meat was a rarity, sugar almost non-existent, and luxury items such as chocolate or coffee were allocated sparingly through ration cards that required careful planning and often long queues. By contrast, POWs in camps like Stalag Luft III or Oflag camps were opening parcels that seemed to overflow with sustenance. For many Allied airmen, this was the first time they had a genuinely filling meal since being captured. A British officer recorded in his diary that the chocolate bars alone felt like treasure, and that the small tin of meat lasted longer than any ration at home. American rations designed to deliver 2,800 to 3,000 calories a day included concentrated proteins, fats, and vitamins, carefully calculated to maintain health in harsh conditions. These parcels were more than food. They were engineered resilience. German guards and camp officials could not help but notice the disparity. Initially, their reactions were muted, constrained by military discipline and adherence to international law. But whispers began to circulate. Enemy soldiers were eating better than the very civilians they had been sent to protect. Some guards admitted to envy. Others expressed silent frustration, observing POWs sharing chocolate and powdered milk among themselves, fortified against the cold and the monotony of confinement. The contrast went beyond calories. Civilians often endured a diet lacking in essential nutrients, leading to fatigue, illness, and weakened immune systems. In many towns, the population relied on potatoes, turnips, and ersatz coffee, consuming fewer than 2,500 calories a day. Meanwhile, POWs received parcels containing not only calories but also variety: canned meats, biscuits, butter substitutes, chocolate, and sometimes even fruit preserves. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical sustenance. Men who were otherwise confined and powerless experienced moments of genuine pleasure and comfort. This imbalance created subtle tensions within camps. Prisoners would openly discuss their parcels, sometimes trading items to ensure everyone received something they preferred. Guards, meanwhile, observed a strange effect. Prisoners became calmer, more cooperative, and physically healthier than before. German officers began to question the fairness of the system, and in some instances compared the parcels to the strict rationing imposed on civilians. Propaganda that painted Allied forces as cruel or decadent now faced a quiet, undeniable contradiction. These same enemies could demonstrate care and logistical precision, even for prisoners. The disparity also highlighted the efficiency of American logistics. Supply chains stretched across oceans, relying on industrial-scale production, refrigerated shipping, and the Red Cross's meticulous distribution network. Even under the constant threat of U-boat attacks in the Atlantic, parcels arrived consistently. This operational mastery contrasted sharply with German shortages caused by disrupted supply lines, poor harvests, and wartime prioritization of the military over civilians. The cumulative effect was stark. The enemy, once an abstract threat, now represented not only military might but the ability to sustain life itself. By early 1944, the cultural and psychological gap widened further. Prisoners recorded anecdotes of sharing a single chocolate bar among several men, savoring every bite, and noting that this luxury was beyond anything available to German civilians. Some guards admitted privately that they themselves would have valued a single parcel for their families. Stories of POWs consuming a full meal, while the streets outside carried whispers of hunger, circulated quietly, underscoring an irony that would not go unnoticed. War had created a world where prisoners could, in some ways, live better than the very citizens of the nation holding them captive. This context, the collision of scarcity, abundance, and human perception, laid the groundwork for a deeper exploration of the event. The American rations were more than mere cans and chocolate. They represented a quiet moral assertion, a logistical triumph, and an unspoken challenge to German assumptions about sustenance, fairness, and the rules of war. The stage was now set. The scene shifts from abstract conditions to the human experience within the camps, the reactions, the emotions, and the angles through which this story of food, survival, and psychological resilience will unfold. For the men confined within Stalag Luft III and other German POW camps, survival was measured in days, calories, and small victories. The arrival of American rations transformed the everyday rhythm of life. It was not merely the food itself but what it represented: care, attention, and connection to a world beyond barbed wire. A single tin of meat or a chocolate bar could inspire conversations, laughter, and a renewed sense of purpose. Prisoners recorded that sharing parcels became an unspoken ritual, a way to maintain camaraderie and moral strength in the bleak winter months. Psychologists today describe such moments as critical for resilience. In the camp, men facing cold, hunger, and monotony found sustenance in the familiarity and richness of the parcels. Rations and Red Cross packages offered more than calories. They were a lifeline to identity and dignity. Letters often spoke of surprise and disbelief. Men compared the contents to meals back home, noting that the quality rivaled or even exceeded civilian diets in many occupied areas. In an environment designed to strip autonomy and control, the simple act of opening a parcel became a reclaiming of humanity. Food, often overlooked in military history, functioned as a subtle but decisive tactical element. Well-fed prisoners were healthier, more alert, and easier to manage. German camp officials noted that parcels reduced illness-related absenteeism from work assignments and minimized friction between prisoners and guards. In practical terms, nutrition could influence camp order and security. Fatigued, underfed men were prone to illness, depression, and occasionally violent disputes. By contrast, those nourished by American rations maintained energy for labor details, escape planning, and even recreational activities, all of which reinforced psychological resilience. Moreover, parcels influenced the behavior of prisoners in smaller tactical ways. Sharing, trading, and rationing their parcels created a sense of hierarchy and self-organization. Officers noted that men who had access to parcels were more willing to maintain discipline within huts and assist with camp operations. Food, in this sense, became both a literal and figurative stabilizer. It was a tool that shaped interactions, morale, and compliance, demonstrating the far-reaching implications of logistical superiority in wartime. Behind every tin of meat, chocolate bar, or packet of biscuits lay a complex technological and logistical machine. American rations were products of industrial precision, calories calculated, vitamins measured, and packaging designed to survive long voyages. Rations, compact and lightweight, were developed for mobile soldiers but proved invaluable for delivery to POWs. Sea rations, canned and sealed, could withstand months at sea, rough handling, and the variable conditions of European winters. Red Cross parcels added another layer of complexity. Each was labeled, cataloged, and carefully packed to maintain nutrition during transport. The journey from factory to camp required coordination across military shipping, neutral intermediaries, and local camp administrators. The Atlantic, patrolled by German U-boats, was a constant threat, yet the parcels arrived with remarkable consistency. This technological achievement reflected not only American industrial capacity, but also strategic foresight. Sustaining prisoners of war through proper nutrition was as much a tool of soft power as military might. Even the contents demonstrated subtle design. chocolate bars and biscuits provided quick energy. Powdered milk and canned vegetables ensured vitamins and minerals. Canned meats delivered protein to sustain muscle mass. Packages were assembled with attention to variety and psychological effect, offering a sense of abundance and normalcy. The sophistication of these parcels contrasted sharply with the scarcity faced by German civilians and highlighted the industrial gap between the warring nations. These perspectives, human, tactical, and technological, reveal the multifaceted significance of American rations in POW camps. They were not merely meals. They were instruments of resilience, order, and psychological influence. But the story does not end here. Leadership decisions, enemy perception, and ethical considerations further complicated the picture. Officers on both sides, soldiers and civilians alike, confronted the implications of a system in which prisoners could sometimes eat better than the people outside the gates. This leads naturally into the next section, where the leadership, moral, and enemy angles will deepen our understanding of this unusual wartime phenomenon. The implementation of American rations for POWs reflected deliberate, calculated leadership decisions. The United States War Department understood that maintaining prisoner health was not only a moral obligation under the Geneva Conventions, but also a practical concern. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to succumb to disease, resist orders, or incite unrest. Officers in charge of logistics coordinated production, packing, and transport with precision, ensuring parcels could reach camps even across hostile territory. At the camp level, German commandants faced the difficult task of balancing discipline with the rules of international law. They could not confiscate parcels without risking scrutiny from the Red Cross or Allied authorities. Many officers admitted privately to frustration as prisoners appeared better nourished than civilians back home. Leadership in this context required both adherence to regulations and management of morale for prisoners, for guards, and for local populations struggling under scarcity. The presence of American rations forced German officers to confront uncomfortable questions about equity, justice, and the practical consequences of food distribution. German soldiers and civilians were not blind to the disparity created by American parcels. Accounts from diaries and reports indicate that guards sometimes observed POWs eating chocolate or canned meat, with a mixture of incredulity and resentment. For men who themselves received limited rations, the sight of well-fed prisoners could provoke shame, envy, and a grudging respect. This perception extended beyond the camp. Propaganda in Germany struggled to reconcile the image of cruel, victorious Wehrmacht forces with prisoners who were visibly well cared for. In some cases, German soldiers privately expressed admiration for the efficiency and abundance of American logistics. The psychological impact was subtle but profound. Enemy perception of the United States shifted, not through battlefield encounters but through tins of meat and chocolate bars. These rations became a symbol of industrial and moral superiority, illustrating that victory in war extended beyond guns and tanks to include the ability to sustain human life effectively. The ethical dimension of feeding POWs better than local civilians was complex and quietly contentious. International law, through the Geneva Conventions, mandated that prisoners receive adequate nourishment, medical care, and humane treatment. American adherence to these laws was meticulous, designed to comply fully with obligations while maximizing the positive impact on prisoner morale. Yet the contrast with German civilian hardship raised difficult questions. Was it justifiable that a man in captivity could consume more calories than a mother standing in line for bread? Were POW parcels a form of moral superiority, or a subtle psychological weapon? Historians note that this disparity highlighted fundamental differences in national priorities. The United States invested heavily in the welfare of captured soldiers, while Germany, strained by total war, could not guarantee the same for its own population. The ethical implications extended beyond ration size. Sharing, trading, and community meals within POW camps created a microcosm of fairness and cooperation that contrasted sharply with the scarcity and competition outside. For prisoners, food was not merely survival. It was a moral anchor, a reminder of order, humanity, and international law in a world dominated by violence and deprivation. Spring 1944. The snow had finally receded from the camp yards, leaving mud and thawing puddles underfoot. Stalag Luft III, home to thousands of Allied airmen, felt the slow rhythm of daily life shift. The Red Cross parcels arriving regularly had begun to accumulate. Prisoners opened tins of meat, chocolate bars, biscuits, and powdered milk with a growing sense of expectation. It was no longer a rare treat. It had become a lifeline, a measured abundance in a world of scarcity. The change in the men was palpable. Officers noted renewed energy during work details, fewer illnesses in the infirmary, and a subtle increase in morale that even the guards could not ignore. Where fatigue and hunger once dominated the huts, conversation now centered on the parcels themselves. Trading items, planning small communal meals, and savoring flavors lost for months. A single tin of meat, when shared among 3 or 4 men, became a moment of ceremony, a temporary restoration of dignity and normalcy. Outside the huts, German guards observed with quiet disbelief. Some recorded in diaries that the prisoners eat better than civilians in the surrounding towns. A statement almost whispered, tinged with shame and incredulity. The disparity was undeniable. Whereas families in Berlin or Dresden might receive a thin slice of bread or a meager portion of margarine, prisoners were consuming full protein meals with energy-dense supplements. The psychological shock of this reality spread through camp command structures. Officers who had long relied on discipline and monotony to control prisoners now faced a subtle, unexpected challenge: a healthier, more confident captive population. The impact of these rations went beyond morale. Escape attempts, previously hindered by exhaustion and poor nutrition, began to show higher success rates, not in numbers of breakout attempts immediately, but in preparation and stamina. Men had energy to dig tunnels, forge documents, or carry out intricate communication schemes. Letters from prisoners describe evenings spent around small stoves, cans clattering as chocolate was rationed and tea brewed from powdered milk. These moments, seemingly trivial, strengthened cohesion, patience, and ingenuity, qualities that could shift outcomes in subtle but significant ways. One particularly telling incident occurred in March 1944. A new shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived just as winter reserves in the camp were running low. Prisoners, many of whom had subsisted on thin soups and German-issued bread, opened tins of corned beef, biscuits, and chocolate bars. Observing guards noted the men's visible excitement, their delicate care in distributing items, and the almost ceremonial nature of consumption. One German officer wrote, "They sit laughing, eating with such discipline, better fed than our own people." These observations marked a turning point in perception. For the first time, some guards admitted privately that the Allied logistical system had achieved a quiet victory. No bomb had fallen, no gun fired, yet the prisoners were thriving, sustained by carefully engineered parcels. The power of nutrition, once a mundane concern, became an instrument of psychological and moral leverage. In a war defined by destruction, the act of feeding could shift balance in ways that bullets or tanks could not. At the same time, the disparity sparked internal conflicts. German civilians, already weakened by rationing, began to ask questions. Rumors of POWs eating well spread quietly through towns and villages. Guards were caught in a moral tension, tasked with supervising prisoners who, in some respects, lived better than the citizens they protected. Officers debated how to respond: reduce rations, limit distribution, but international law and scrutiny from neutral observers, particularly the Red Cross, left little room for adjustment. The system was resilient, meticulously planned, and unassailable. By late spring, the quiet tension reached its apex. Prisoners grew stronger, more resilient, and more confident in their routines. Guards, civilians, and even some German officers recognized an uncomfortable truth. Nutrition could confer power. It could elevate morale, enhance physical capability, and influence the subtle dynamics of control and perception. In effect, American parcels were rewriting the rules of captivity, not through violence but through sustenance. This moment, the convergence of abundance, perception, and resilience, would set the stage for irreversible change. The shock of well-fed prisoners, the quiet envy of guards, and the stark contrast with civilian hardship crystallized into a broader realization. War was not only fought on battlefields, but in kitchens, pantries, and distribution networks, and the implications would ripple beyond the gates of Stalag Luft III, shaping both morale and strategy in ways few had anticipated. By summer 1944, the contrast between prisoners and civilians had reached its peak. In Stalag Luft III and other camps, parcels arrived with near-clockwork regularity. POWs now lived on diets that not only sustained but strengthened them. High-calorie meals rich in protein, fats, and vitamins, providing energy for both body and mind. The psychological effect was profound. Men regained a sense of control over their daily lives, developed routines around meals, and used the parcels to reinforce camaraderie. Sharing a single tin of meat became a communal ritual, a rare moment of agency in an otherwise controlled existence. For the German guards, the situation became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Diaries and letters from camp officers reveal subtle frustration. Prisoners were healthier, more resilient, and in some cases more organized than expected. The American luxury, as some called it privately, stood in stark contrast to the growing scarcity outside the camps. Families in Berlin, Hamburg, and smaller towns queued for ration cards that barely supplied daily sustenance, while men in uniform, confined behind barbed wire, enjoyed chocolate, canned meat, and coffee. The inequity was impossible to ignore. The effect extended beyond morale. Prisoners, strengthened by adequate nutrition, undertook projects previously hindered by fatigue or illness.
Escape preparations, digging tunnels, forging documents, and coordinating with fellow inmates benefited from the physical and mental energy that the parcels provided.
Even minor tasks such as maintaining huts, repairing equipment, or organizing educational activities became more manageable. Nutrition, often underestimated, had become a tactical asset, subtly reshaping life within the camps. An illustrative incident occurred in July 1944. A shipment of Red Cross parcels coincided with an outbreak of dysentery in one section of the camp. Prisoners who had received the parcels exhibited greater resistance to illness, recovering faster than those dependent solely on German rations. Medical officers noted the difference in physical resilience and credited the carefully planned nutrition of the parcels with preventing wider contagion. The impact was both literal and symbolic. Food had become a shield, not just a supplement. The disparity between prisoners and civilians also sparked quiet unrest outside the camp. Reports from German towns describe murmurs of discontent among civilians who observed, often through letters or rumors, that prisoners, many of them Allied officers, were receiving richer meals than the people themselves. For the first time, the moral authority of camp administrators was tested not only by the need to maintain order, but by the social perception of fairness. The mere act of feeding prisoners became a political and ethical statement. Within the camps, the turning point crystallized in small but telling ways. Officers recorded that prisoners, now consistently nourished, exhibited higher morale, less irritability, and more organized behavior. Arguments and disputes over rations decreased, replaced by cooperation and strategic planning. Guards, initially uneasy, began to recognize that well-fed prisoners were easier to manage. The psychological impact of sustenance had translated into operational stability, a quiet, indirect victory for the Allied logistical system. By mid-1944, the broader implications were undeniable. German officers and civilians alike had to confront the unsettling reality that industrial efficiency and careful planning could sustain life even in captivity. War was no longer measured purely in weapons and territory. It was also measured in the capacity to feed, strengthen, and maintain human beings under extraordinary conditions. American rations, in their abundance, highlighted disparities in infrastructure, resource allocation, and moral priorities. The culmination of these moments, the arrival of parcels, the observable improvement in prisoner health, and the quiet resentment of guards and civilians, represented a turning point in the perception of power. For the first time, the war inside the camps was not simply a struggle of control, but a demonstration of industrial and ethical superiority. What began as a simple act of nourishment had grown into a strategic, moral, and psychological statement. In this way, the climax of the story is not marked by a single battle or violent confrontation, but by the subtle, undeniable influence of food. Rations became instruments of morale, tools of order, and symbols of disparity, altering behavior and perception on all sides. The stage was now set for the aftermath, in which the consequences of these seemingly small acts would ripple outward, affecting prisoners, civilians, and the broader course of the war. By late 1944, the effects of American rations on POWs were unmistakable. Prisoners across Stalag Luft III, OFLAG camps and others had grown stronger, healthier and more resilient than expected. Medical officers noted that illness rates were lower than in previous winters, and physical strength allowed men to maintain work details, tunnel projects, and other survival activities. Diaries from Allied officers frequently described the parcels as miraculous, not merely for sustaining life but for restoring morale and a sense of dignity. The contrast with German civilians could not have been starker. In Berlin, Dresden, and countless smaller towns, families scraped together meager portions of bread, potatoes, and margarine. Sugar, coffee, and chocolate were either rationed to near invisibility or available only on the black market. Starvation, fatigue, and malnutrition had become daily realities. Letters from the front lines and reports from neutral observers highlighted the stark disparity. Men imprisoned by the enemy often consumed more calories than those living freely under German rule. The psychological implications were profound, creating quiet envy, frustration, and moral tension. For the German guards, the situation produced mixed reactions. Some adhered strictly to regulations, performing duties without comment. Others, however, were forced to confront the irony of the situation. Diaries from camp officers record phrases such as, "They eat better than our own people," and "It feels wrong to see them nourished while families outside starve." These private reflections reveal that the logistics of sustenance had created an unspoken moral and psychological confrontation, challenging assumptions about superiority, control, and fairness. The practical consequences were equally tangible. Well-fed prisoners were easier to manage, more cooperative, and physically capable of enduring labor and cold winters. Escape preparations, long hampered by malnutrition and fatigue, gained renewed energy. Tunnels were dug with greater precision, forged documents carried out with steadier hands, and coordinated communications maintained with heightened alertness. Nutrition, it became clear, was not a trivial concern. It was a force multiplier, enhancing both morale and operational capacity within the camps. Red Cross reports from 1944-45 document these effects in detail. One report noted that parcels arriving in Stalag Luft III consistently offset deficits from German rations, ensuring prisoners consumed an average of 2,800–3,000 calories daily. Comparisons with German civilians during the same period indicated daily intakes of less than 1,500 calories in many urban areas. The numbers underscored what prisoners already knew. Their survival, comfort, and physical strength were directly tied to the efficiency and abundance of American logistics. This disparity also had subtle political ramifications. Propaganda within Germany struggled to reconcile the narrative of a powerful, organized nation with the reality that enemy prisoners were better fed than ordinary citizens. For some civilians, the knowledge that POWs received Red Cross parcels fueled resentment. For guards, it generated unease and occasional quiet admiration for Allied efficiency. Across Europe, food had become more than sustenance. It was a lens through which fairness, morality, and competence were measured. In camps themselves, prisoners developed small but meaningful traditions around their rations. Communal meals, sharing chocolate or biscuits, and organizing small treat days fostered solidarity. Officers recorded that these acts strengthened bonds between men of different nationalities, maintained morale during harsh winters, and provided a rhythm of normalcy in an otherwise disrupted world. Nutrition had become both a practical necessity and a psychological anchor. By the end of 1944, the scene was clear. American rations had achieved what weapons could not. They had sustained life, bolstered morale, and even subtly altered the dynamics of captivity. Prisoners were stronger, more organized, and more resilient. Civilians outside struggled under scarcity, and German officers were left to confront the quiet power of logistical superiority. These effects would ripple into the final months of the war, influencing not only the behavior of prisoners but also perceptions of Allied planning, ethics, and industrial capacity. The stage is now set for the second part of the aftermath, which will explore long-term consequences, the broader social, strategic, and historical effects of this disparity in sustenance. As 1945 approached, the long-term consequences of American rations for POWs became increasingly evident. Men who had endured years of confinement emerged healthier than expected, with both physical and mental reserves intact. Reports from liberated camps documented that POWs had average body weights closer to pre-capture levels than anticipated, a testament to the consistent nutrition provided by Red Cross and American parcels. In contrast, German civilians were physically weakened, their bodies strained by prolonged shortages and malnutrition. The disparity highlighted the strategic advantage embedded in logistical foresight. Feeding prisoners was not merely humanitarian, it was an exercise in sustaining strength, morale, and organizational stability under duress. The psychological impact extended beyond the camps. Liberated prisoners often recounted their astonishment at the richness of the rations compared to civilian diets in occupied territories. Many letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs note a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The food had kept them alive, strengthened their morale, and, in some cases, allowed them to maintain a sense of identity and agency. Officers emphasized how the parcels had reinforced social cohesion, enabled cooperative work, and even assisted in escape attempts and clandestine intelligence sharing. Nutrition had become a quiet yet decisive factor in survival and operational effectiveness. For the German population, knowledge of this disparity was a bitter revelation. Civilians in urban centers and occupied territories were already enduring severe hardship. Limited calories, poor quality substitutes for essential items, and a constant threat of Allied bombing. Hearing that prisoners, confined behind barbed wire, were consuming well-balanced meals fueled quiet resentment and moral dissonance. Diaries and letters from this period reveal frustration and incredulity, particularly among those who had previously believed that POWs were suffering as much as, if not more than, civilians. The consequences also extended into policy and planning. German officers recognized that Allied efficiency in supplying prisoners demonstrated industrial and organizational superiority. It underscored the logistical gap between nations, the ability to manufacture, package, and deliver thousands of parcels reliably across oceans, even under enemy attack, highlighted the United States' industrial capacity in ways that weapons alone could not. In post-war analyses, military historians noted that logistics had become an instrument of both moral and practical power. The war was fought not only with bombs and bullets, but with food, supply chains, and careful planning. Humanitarian principles and international law were also reinforced through these experiences. The consistent delivery of parcels adhered to the Geneva Conventions, illustrating that adherence to legal and moral obligations could be operationally feasible, even during total war. The success of American rations became a model for future military and relief operations, influencing post-war policies for POW treatment, refugee aid, and international humanitarian logistics. By the spring of 1945, liberation brought the full perspective of these disparities into focus. POWs emerged nourished, organized, and psychologically resilient, while many German civilians faced continued hardship in devastated cities. The contrast served as a living record of the quiet power of sustenance. Industrial efficiency, ethical foresight, and logistical precision had not only preserved lives, but also subtly influenced morale, perception, and strategic advantage. The legacy of these events extended far beyond the individual camps. Prisoners carried the memory of well-planned, abundant rations into their post-war lives, often reflecting on the profound impact that food had on survival, dignity, and resilience. German officers and civilians, meanwhile, were left to confront the moral and practical implications of scarcity versus abundance, witnessing firsthand how a seemingly simple element, nutrition, could shift perceptions of power and fairness in wartime. The scene was now set for reflection. The story of American rations and the surprising abundance they provided is more than a tale of food. It is a lesson in logistics, morality, human resilience, and the quiet forces that shape history. In the quiet aftermath of war, the story of American rations in POW camps endures as a testament to the power of planning, compassion, and foresight. What began as tins of meat, chocolate, biscuits, and coffee became instruments of survival, morale, and dignity. Prisoners confined behind barbed wire and facing the harsh realities of captivity were nourished not only in body, but in spirit. Each parcel represented the careful calculation of calories, nutrients, and psychological impact, a reminder that even in a world consumed by destruction, humanity could persist through small, deliberate acts. The contrast with German civilians underscores a profound lesson. Scarcity and abundance do not merely affect physical health, they shape perception, morality, and social cohesion. For prisoners, the parcels fostered camaraderie and resilience. For guards and civilians, they provoked reflection, envy, and an undeniable awareness of disparity. Logistics, often viewed as a mundane aspect of war, became a subtle weapon of influence, demonstrating that the ability to sustain life is inseparable from the exercise of power. History remembers battles, strategies, and leaders, but here the quiet turning point was measured in calories and parcels. The ability of the United States to feed prisoners consistently, efficiently, and abundantly left a legacy that transcended survival. It challenged assumptions about strength, morality, and fairness, revealing that the human element, the need for nourishment, dignity, and care, remains central to the story of war. As we reflect on this episode, it is clear that the smallest details, a chocolate bar, a tin of meat, a shared biscuit, carry weight far beyond their physical substance. They shaped morale, preserved health, and reinforced the moral imperatives of international law. They remind us that even amid the chaos of conflict, human ingenuity and ethical foresight can sustain life and hope, quietly altering the course of history. In the end, the story of American rations is more than a tale of food. It is a story of resilience, humanity, and the profound ways that sustenance can define both survival and history itself.